Indigenous Rights Radio, because knowledge is power.
In partnership with Griffith University, UNESCO is undertaking a landmark global study on Indigenous peoples and media. The study analyzes existing research, identifies critical issues, and provides a comprehensive overview of Indigenous media landscapes worldwide. This research will highlight the importance of Indigenous media in empowering communities and combating stereotypes, while examining policy approaches and training opportunities for Indigenous journalists. The study's findings will be used to advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples to establish and access media as outlined in Article 16 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. During a 2-day expert meeting and media partnership forum on Indigenous peoples and the media, held at UNESCO's headquarters in Paris, Cultural Survival spoke with lead researcher of Griffith University about the significant findings of the global study on Indigenous peoples and the media.
My name is Susan Forde. I'm a researcher at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. I'm here at UNESCO presenting some work that we've done for UNESCO about Indigenous peoples and media around the world. I'll start by saying I'm a non-Indigenous woman working on this project, but we have worked with a big team of Indigenous researchers on the work. They've asked me to come here to UNESCO and present this work. The literature review that we did was to try and understand what research had been done about Indigenous peoples and media in the past, and what were the key issues that had been covered by previous research and what new research was needed. We looked at all research on Indigenous peoples and media in English, Spanish and French, and found a great deal of the literature was coming from the Asia Pacific region, including Australia and New Zealand, and also from North America and Europe. And then an increasing amount of research about Indigenous peoples and media is coming from Latin American regions. And there's a lot of leading conceptual and empirical work being done in the Latin American countries. What we found, of course, is that Indigenous media is very important around the world, and there's an increasing number of Indigenous media outlets around the world to give voice to Indigenous peoples and also to combat the stereotypes of Indigenous peoples that mainstream media often makes. We also found that for Indigenous-led media or Indigenous-owned media, there are very different approaches around the world to policies that support Indigenous media, to funding arrangements, and to ways in which Indigenous journalists and producers are supported and trained to produce their own media and to lead their own media. We were also interested in looking at what sort of mechanisms exist within non-Indigenous media, in public service media and commercial media, to help guide journalists and editors about the type of content that they should be producing about Indigenous peoples and about Indigenous issues. And there's a great deal of research that shows that there are a lot of codes of conduct and guidelines for the ways in which Indigenous issues and peoples should be covered, but that most of those codes of conduct are self-regulatory, and they're not really enforced at a national level. So they're attempts to write the coverage of Indigenous peoples, but it's not something that's being enforced legally at all, and there's a need for that. I think the main important finding that we made through the literature review was that there was a lot of research going on about Indigenous peoples in media at national levels. So there was lots of research coming out of Colombia, out of Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, parts of Asia, Scandinavia, but a lot of the work that was coming out was very much based on those particular countries and what was happening within those nations. There was really no research that was covering Indigenous peoples and media on a global scale. And so the work that UNESCO is now doing and wants to continue doing is to do a global study whereby Indigenous peoples and media as an issue and Indigenous media itself can be looked at from an international perspective rather than from these sort of small-scale national perspectives. I think in the room here today at this meeting that we're having with UNESCO, we're certainly getting the understanding that the context for Indigenous media differs greatly around the world. The policy settings for Indigenous media differ greatly. There are so many different languages involved that it's very difficult to do an international study of Indigenous media, and certainly of the content of the way Indigenous peoples are covered in the media. But UNESCO is attempting to do this global study so that there is at least some benchmarking data for the first time about this major topic of Indigenous media. And I think a lot of the data that Indigenous media is often missing is about how important they are to their communities, how valued they are by their communities and by their audiences, and also the important role that Indigenous media plays in giving voice to Indigenous peoples. And so hopefully one of the aims and one of the achievements of the study will be to give Indigenous media around the world the opportunity to have data gathered about the importance of this sector, about the fact that having media and having a voice is essential to the human rights of Indigenous peoples around the world, and that in all different countries, this idea in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, this access to media, the right to establish your own media, and the right to access information that is free from discrimination is something that will be closer to being realised as a result of this work.
For more information on Indigenous people's rights, visit cs.org and follow Cultural Survival on Facebook, Instagram, and X.